That in of itself is part of the miracle of creation. That God, who is complete unto himself, who had perfect relationship with himself in Trinity, had no need for anything else. He didn't need us. He didn't need the world. He didn't need to create. In fact, it would have been much easier simply not to. But out of his fullness and out of his goodness, God did something incredible, and he began the act of creation. He began to form the world and to form us. And that is the story that we get to jump into as we're going through this series on the Genesis. For these next few weeks, we'll be looking at the first about 12 chapters of Genesis, figuring out this creation that God made. How is it that humans are going to begin to interact with it and interact with its creator? And so I hope that you continue to join us as we go through this series, because I'm really excited about what's happening. Last week, Dave kicked us off looking at Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Today, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1, the rest of it, 3 through 31. So go ahead and turn to your Bibles there if you would like to. I'm not going to give you a page number. It's toward the front. You'll find it. Dave reminded us of a couple important things that we need to get as we move forward last week. The first is this, that we're talking about God. God is the one who creates. He is the one who is at the center of this story. And if we miss that, we miss the intent of what Genesis is attempting to do. Genesis is telling us what it is that God has been up to in the formation of this world and his people. And so the fact that this is about God is paramount. But the other thing he told us is this. Genesis is a curious book because it was written to a very different culture. People who asked very different kinds of questions than we might ask right now. As a result, even some little bits of language sometimes seem a bit off. He spoke about how for them, when you use a phrase like in the beginning, it was a time period. It includes the start point, but it's much more than that. For us, when we think of the beginning, we think of the exact start moment and not a whole lot more. And so some of those nuances kind of come into play as we understand what the original hearers would have understood. Which is a tad bit difficult for us, because when we come to the Genesis chapter 1 passage, at least for me, and I think for a lot of us, we come to it with our set of sort of modern science questions. In particular, how does evolution fit or not fit into this passage? And that tends to be what dominates our discussions and tends to be what dominates the cultural discussions around Genesis 1. And these are important questions, things that we have to begin to wrestle with, and things that are very personal to a lot of people. People who hold one side might accuse the other of trying to manipulate science to fit their interpretation of the Bible, while the other side will say just the opposite, that they are trying to do biblical gymnastics in order to mesh with current scientific theories. And in either case, then, we have Christians who are beginning to argue with each other on a very passionate level. And here's the thing, these discussions are good. They're helpful insofar as they help us understand our Creator through the creation. But sometimes they begin to pull us apart. And this is one of those issues that ultimately is not the issue. The issue is God, that God is behind all things. And when we can accept that together as Christians, we can begin to move forward and have some very healthy conversations. So as a result, I'm not going to talk a lot about the debate that exists between creation and evolution. That's not what this morning is going to be about. Instead, we're going to be talking about this idea of God setting up shop. God coming in and doing something unique in human history. However, we're not going to leave those questions unaddressed. We are bringing in someone who's going to deal with the questions of faith and science and creation and evolution. And so her name is Leslie Wickham, and you can see kind of her deal there in your worship folder. On January 26th, she'll be coming in and talking about exploring the wonders of creation through the lens of science. And on February 9th, she'll be talking about creation and evolution, a spectrum of Christian viewpoints. She'll be doing that in the center building at 9 o'clock and 10:30, so you can come to a service here for one of them and go there for the other. It's going to be a really awesome opportunity. I hope that you don't miss it. College students also, she'll be coming to you guys as well on February 9th, and you'll have the opportunity to talk with her about some of these things at 7 o'clock on February 9th. So I'm excited about what's going on with this. I hope that you're able to make it. But for this morning, instead of focusing on those questions, we're going to focus on some different ones. See, the question that we tend to ask is a how question. How is it that God created the universe? How is it that God formed the world? We want to know the nitty-gritty details. We want to get in there and see exactly what it is that he did. The hard part, though, is that Genesis chapter 1 really isn't trying to answer that question. And so when we approach the text, we have to do it in a way that's faithful to what the text is attempting to do. It's a little bit like if someone was 16 and wanted to learn how to drive a car and you handed them an auto manual. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near them on the road if that's all the driving experience they had. They might be a good mechanic, but it's not going to work out for them on the road. Or for me to look at an anatomy textbook and assume that from that I can derive relationship advice. Clearly, we're meant to be together for eternity because I can name all the bones in your wrist. That's just not the right thing here. And so for Genesis is asking very different questions than the questions that we usually come to it asking. It isn't asking the how. The how isn't the primary motivation. So you have to remember this. Israel was surrounded by different cultures who had their own creation stories. And so kind of the earliest idea we can have of when Genesis was written would be just coming out of captivity in Egypt. Later, it might have been captivity in Babylon. Either way, they're surrounded by cultures that have their own understanding of how the world came to be. But the how was never the big thing that they were trying to accomplish. They were trying to ask two different kinds of questions. Their scientific knowledge was very limited. They weren't trying to create a specific understanding of what the world looked like in a perfect picture because they knew better than we do that they didn't have it all figured out. They knew that there were a lot of questions that remained unanswered. What was most important to them wasn't the how, but the who and the why. Who is it that made things the way that they are? What are the deities? What are the things that we should be worshiping or paying homage to? The things that set up the world as it is. And then the why question. Why is it that these deities, that these gods would have gone through all this trouble? What were they trying to accomplish? What were they hoping to see at the end of the day? And so the creation stories that you see in Egypt or Babylon or any number of them deal with these questions. Who was responsible for it and why did they do it? Now, there's some very strong commonalities between a lot of these. The stories, they differ, their understandings of what happened differ, but there's some very important threads that kind of go through a lot of these stories. One is this: the who is always plural. There's a lot of people, deities, gods involved in the process. Things that take up positions. So sometimes celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, sometimes even lakes, rivers, animals, they take on sort of a deific property. They are responsible in some way for the world as it is. And so these are things that need to be worshipped. And the why is also interesting. In most cases, the why is either this was a happy accident and the gods have left us alone, or the gods have created us to fulfill a certain purpose, in the particular serving them, taking care of creation so they don't have to, essentially being slaves to this world order that they made. And so if that's true, then you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to appease a god who's going to be angry at you, or trying to figure out how to manipulate the gods so that life will turn out the way that you want it to, so that the elements will not destroy you, so that your crops will grow. And so these are the kinds of things that people were looking for, the who and the why, because the who and the why told them how to live. And so when we have the ability to come to the Genesis 1 passage, asking the same kinds of questions that the Israelites were, we understand that the questions that were important to them and spoke to them speak to us today. Because Genesis 1 was an answer. It was the Israelites' answer to the question of who and why. For all of these other cultures that had all these other concepts, Israel wanted to say something very unique. Our God is different than anything you could have imagined. And the reason he created is going to blow your mind. So go ahead and jump in verse 3. We're going to start to begin to look through the 6 days of creation and see if we can get a picture of who and why creation exists for. So, the first 3 days tend to kind of follow a certain sort of pattern. It's like this. The first 3 days run parallel to the second 3. It's pretty easy to see. If you read it through it yourself, you'll probably get there on your own pretty quick. The first 3 days tend to operate out of functions. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be saying here, I owe to John Walton, so I want to give him credit for a lot of these ideas. But a lot of people have used different language over the years. If I've talked about maybe realms of creation, I like the word functions in part because it sounds mathematic-y, and that's fun to me. It's just kind of how I think. These are things that they're the framework. They operate outside the individual pieces. They're things that have to be, or things could not continue to work as we want them to. And so God has to set up these frameworks before he begins to populate them. He has to set up these ideas of what creation is trying to accomplish, what the order is going to be, before he begins to put things into place perfectly. So here's what's going on. Day 1, we're starting with light. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Now, when I read this passage, I tend to kind of impose what I learned, in 7th grade science on it, which is this idea of light is this combination of photons. And I kind of have this idea of how light interacts with the world around us. One of the things that Dave reminded us last week was this. For these ancient peoples, they could not have envisioned the world as we typically do. They could not have pictured the blue marble because, they didn't have the Hubble telescope or satellite imagery of what the Earth looked like. All they could see is what was immediately in front of them. They didn't have the zoomed out view. And so as they're trying to describe creation, what they have in front of them is all they can really draw on. And when we're talking about light and darkness, and you see this in other passages, light and darkness are less material, they're almost more theological. It's the establishment of what is good and what is evil, and how those two interplay. And essentially, as they're looking through this, they also are realizing this, that light and darkness have a way of creating something in the world that otherwise wouldn't exist. It's light and darkness that give us a sense of time. Light and darkness that help us to begin to be able to operate on a linear path. See, God, who is greater than any of these things, has no particular need of time himself, but realize that for the created order, the purpose that he is going for, this needs to be. And so, from the get-go, he's creating something so uniquely profound and so basic to who we are that sometimes we just miss it. It raises questions like, for a God who existed before time, is existing outside of time the same as existing for an infinite period of time before it started? I don't know. Can God lift a rock or make a rock he can't lift? I don't know. It's these questions about paradoxes, things we can't understand. But God is creating a system that we are going to be able to put ourselves into. He's creating day and night, light and dark. And so from the beginning, we have this sense that there is a pattern to the world that is being made. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day. The second day, God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under it, separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. I still remember being in high school and reading this passage because, Genesis is a fun book to read through, and I'm looking at these verses, and it doesn't make any sense to me. Water under, water over, a vault, that was completely baffling. If you read a bunch of different translations, that word takes on different forms. Vault is what the NIV says, and then there's expanse, there's firmament. These are all words I don't get. I understand clouds. That's what I get, right? I understand atmosphere. I understand what I learned in science class. This is just completely weird to me. So what we have to remember is this, again, this is an ancient community who still could only operate based on what they saw. Sometimes this bothers us a little bit, but we have to remember God has not been going before us, giving us all of the scientific revelations before we get there ourselves, and that's still true today. God instead chooses to speak to his people in ways that they understand at the time they can understand them. And so it may be that this passage is a little bit strange to us because it's based on an understanding of the world that just doesn't seem to fit our current conceptions of how the world works. And that's okay. It worked for them. And it worked for the Israelites in particular because when other cultures would read Genesis 1, they would actually be able to understand it because they were using similar language. They were using similar ways of understanding the world. So here's kind of the way of viewing the world that existed in those times for not just the Israelites, for most cultures around. They had this basic idea that everywhere they went, there was water. Water existed everywhere. You walk around land long enough, you're going to hit water. And so water surrounds you wherever you go. Conversely, you see a blue sky, you see that water comes from the sky, and so the best assumption that they have is that there's basically this dome of water on top of where they are, and that's separating them from the heavens. And so the sky, then, is this, it's almost a pillar, it's almost a material structure, it's something that's actually holding up that water, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. But if you can think about not having our current scientific understandings, it's about as good of an explanation as anything else. And so here they are in Genesis 2, using what was kind of the common language to explain what they could see. And so other cultures could understand that as well. And so when we're talking about then this vault in the sky, the separations, you have this God who is creating a world that is habitable. See, if everything was water, we couldn't survive. If God did not do this act on the second day, the climate would be so harsh that nothing living could actually be there. And so God in the second day, if in the first day he's creating time, in the second day he's creating a sort of climate, a weather system, an environment where people and things and living creatures could actually survive. Where they would actually be protected from the things that could do them harm. So God, in this act of separation, is creating space in creation. But it's still just space. The space in and of itself was not the purpose. This is a function. This is a framework for what's still coming. All right, day 3. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. It's not just enough to have a space that's not going to immediately kill you. We know that as living organisms, we need things that are going to sustain us. And so God begins this process of separating out the land and producing vegetation, sustenance, food, something that could be used for inhabitants to continue to move forward. And so God, in the first 3 days, has created 3 incredible frameworks. The framework of time, the framework of a habitable climate, and the framework of sustenance, of food, of the ability for living things to actually be there. And though we see the vegetation, the kind of the intent of these things isn't there yet. This is the 3 days. This is set up. It's preparing for something. And we know that these 3 things are important to the author of Genesis because it's not just in this passage that they show up. In the story of Noah, after the flood, God is essentially explained to Noah what he is promising. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. This is basically days 1 through 3 in reverse order. Seed time and harvest, there will always be something to sustain you. Summer and winter, day and night, there will always be seasons. There will always be a climate that you can exist in. Day and night, there will always be time. There will always be a movement forward. These things will always be there because we know these things have to be there. They must be in existence for us to be part of it. So God has created this framework. Now, if you're one of these other cultures and you already have your creation story and you're starting to read the Israelite one, you're probably at this point making some edits because there's some things that the Israelites are clearly doing wrong. For one, they still only have one God in the picture, all right? And so there's something up with that. They're not quite sure. But, there's still 3 more days. There's a little bit of hope there. The other is this. We've gone 3 days and we still have no idea why it is that God is doing any of this. Why is God actually creating? Why is he making this space? I mean, they've seen other deities do similar things, separating. They have stories of deities who are creating things for sustenance. They get that. But they already understood why. It was always for a selfish motive of that deity. There's no why, and there's only one who. What's going on with this? This is where we come into the next 3 days. The next 3 days, they run parallel to the first 3. Essentially, what happens in day 4 correlates to day 1. What happens in day 5 correlates to day 2. And what happens in day 6 correlates to day 3. If days 1 through 3 were functions, frameworks, days 4 through 6 are functionaries. Things that are put in place to live out the intent of what was established in days 1 through 3. They have a purpose based on what God had already designed in the first 3 days. So look at day 4. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the great light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day. All right, sometimes this one also baffles us a little bit because we didn't get the second day quite right. If you remember our picture of the second day, if this is kind of your view of the world, then when you're dealing with things like the sun, the moon, and the stars, it has to fit with what you've already established. And so for them, they don't really have a good concept of space or atmosphere or things outside the earth. Those things just kind of get relegated to the generic heavens. And so instead, you place things like the sun, the moon, and the stars in that sky, that firmament, that expanse, all kind of within that dome, if you will. They didn't understand how these things worked. That was a bit beyond them. But they understood that they worked, and they understood why, because God had a function for them. God had a purpose. These things didn't exist as an entity to themselves. They exist to fulfill the function of day one, of keeping time, of demarcating seasons. And for them, seasons were important because it determined festivals, things that moved them forward as a people group. And so these things mattered. What's really interesting here is that it's almost like a slap in the face against the other cultures of the time, because there was great care not to name these entities. They're not named as the sun and the moon. They're named as the greater light and the lesser light. It's almost as if it's an overt statement. Do not mistake these things as things to be worshipped. These are not things to be bowed down to be sacrificed to. These are things that belong to God. God put them there. He had a very specific intent in having them there. They aren't worthy of worship. They point to the one who is. And so these things then begin to fill the intent of day one. Day 5, and God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. All right, so if you remember the second day, that was the creation of sort of a climate that things could actually survive in. Now, the function of the birds and the animals in the ocean isn't to actually keep the weather. That's not their purpose. It's that in day 2, you have this framework that by itself was empty. It needed to be fulfilled. There were certain things that needed to happen for it to meet its purpose. And that's what you're seeing on day 5. In day 5, the sky is filled, the oceans are filled with things that can live in them. They meet the exact purpose of the Creator, which still for other cultures, again, was a little bit difficult. If you remember last week, Dave talked about the word bara. It's a word that means to create. And it's a word that only God can use. Only God can bara. Only He can create in that sense. The rest of this passage in Genesis, except for the very beginning there, we've been using a different word for create this whole time, a word that humans could use as well. We don't see bara again until the oceans, until he's creating the sea creatures. And this is curious. What a lot of scholars think is this. For other cultures, the oceans were mysterious. The depths there created some major problems for them. What existed in the waters was either more deities or at least enemies. It's like the unknown dark lurking beneath the mountains of Moria. You know, whatever's down there, you don't want to touch it. You stay away. It's not part of the good harmony of the world. But God put them there. God made them. There's an intent there. He wants them to be there. They aren't things to be scared of. They're not things that are evil. They're not chaotic. They're not outside creation. They're purposeful. Everything is purposeful. Everything is underneath what God is doing. At this point, if you're one of the other cultures and you're reading this, you're just kind of losing your mind. Like, no, you don't understand. These are mysteries too great for us. Clearly, these things, these giant creatures in the seas, they must be their own gods. They must be worthy of worship. And Israel is saying, no, just listen. On day 6, God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. There's some more curious language here, this idea of the land producing animals, which in my mind is something akin to when your child asks you, where do babies come from? And you say the hospital. You know, it's you're not lying, but it's actually what they can understand at that moment. And it's kind of this nifty image of this land is producing the things that it was meant to be in it. But really, in any of the Old Testament passages, and actually just in ancient literature in general, you can't distinguish between what happens on the land and what happens with God. God is behind it all. God is there. God is creating these things. He is creating the animals on the land that he separated out in day 3. And these animals are able to sustain themselves based on the vegetation that we saw in day 3. So here you have it, creation. Creation working approximately as it should. You have these functions in the first 3 days that are designed to sustain the life that could inhabit it. And then the second 3 days, you have these functionaries, things that are fulfilling the purpose of creation. But we're not done. It would be fair at this point to still ask the question, why? Why would God go through all of this trouble when it's so much easier not to? Why would God establish all of this? To what end? To what purpose? We're not going to read the last few verses because what's going to happen next week is Dave is going to tackle what is some of the most theologically profound passages in Genesis. Theologians have called it the Imago Dei, this idea that humans come into this world created in the image of God. A mystery so incredible we can't fully wrap our minds around it, but Dave's going to try. But here's what we know, and here's what we gather from the first 6 days of creation. Everything has been set. Everything is put in motion. Humans don't show up on the picture until everything is ready. All of creation was moving toward one major climax, one major pinnacle, one prime example of God's creative work. The thing that he prizes the most, so much so that he declared that his own image resides in it. And that is us, humanity. And in particular, humanity to be in relationship with God. See, for the ancient Israelites, the question of how was secondary. They oftentimes knew better than we do that they didn't get it all figured out. But the questions of who and why were absolutely important. You cannot miss these things. These things matter. Who? God is responsible for all of creation. There is nothing in creation that exists outside of his will, outside of his intent. It is all part of the harmony. There is no second deity. In fact, in many ways, Genesis dispels a lot of questions that have been asked over the years. It dispels the idea, of course, of atheism. God is involved in it. It dispels polytheism, the idea that there are multiple gods. There's only the one all-powerful God. It dispels pantheism, the idea that God is creation. God isn't creation. He made creation, and he works over and above and with it. It dissolves the idea of materialism, that this world is simply to be consumed or that it exists only on its own accord, because God is clearly in every step of the process. And it isn't just that God set it up and backed off. It isn't some just happy circumstance, and God certainly didn't create the world so that we would all be slaves to it. God created the world because of his love for humanity, because he wanted to be in relationship with us, which to me is a more profound mystery than even why he created things in the first place. God, who is complete unto himself, wants to be in relationship with us. If you know the rest of the story, God did not stop with creation. He did not stop with setting up the earth. God ultimately would give up everything to be with us. We don't serve a God who made us by mistake or by chance. We don't serve a God who demands that we essentially are slaves to creation. We serve a God who in his infinite mystery and goodness has worked for humanity, has worked to create something so that he can be in relationship with humanity. A mystery so profound and so deep that really, when you think about it, makes every other question we ask about Genesis kind of seem not nearly as important. Because God is the one who is at work, and we have the opportunity to join with him in his vast, incredible, and mysterious creation. We have that opportunity to step in and say, we acknowledge that God is the who, that he is the one who set things up. We acknowledge that God did this for a relationship with humanity. And now as people, we have the opportunity to respond. Let's pray together. God, your creation is a profound mystery that we cannot fully understand. We just don't get it all. We're not going to. Because, God, you are bigger than we are. You're bigger than our questions, bigger than our understandings. But, God, your love is also big. It's bigger than anything we could begin to fully comprehend as well. It's that love that chose to create when you didn't have to. It's that love that chose to set up a world where we could exist. It's that love that causes you time and time again to enter into our lives and allow us to have relationship with you. And it's that love that caused you to send your only son to die for us so that we could spend eternity with you. God, that is the profound truth that we do not want to miss this morning. God, help us to be a people who acknowledge in all things that you are God, that you are worthy. You alone are worthy of our worship. And we pray. Amen.